Our next talk is also a football talk. We have tracking the intangible, quantifying effort in the NFL. So joining us in person, we have Luke Snavely from Robert Morris University, and joining us virtually, we have Emily Shteynberg from NYU and Sheryl Solorzano from Amherst College. And this project is in partnership with Sam Ventura from the Buffalo Sabres.
And Sheryl, feel free to unmute and yourselves and your video. Okay. Turn it over to Luke in the room.
All right. Hello, everyone. Before we get started, I'd just like to give a massive thank you to Kwong and Dr. Yurko for putting together this conference and just the entire program. I think we can all agree that this summer was definitely an awesome experience. I'd also like to thank Sam Ventura for advising the program or our project. He was a great help, a great advisor, really gave us this idea and helped us with the modeling with it. So without further ado, I'm Luke Snavely. I'm joined by Sheryl and Emily online, and this is our project, Tracking the Intangible, Quantifying Effort in the NFL. So what does it mean? There we go. So you hear this phrase a whole bunch, to give your all or to give your 100%. But what does that actually mean? Take this play, for example. It's a week 3 rush when Christian McCaffrey was still on the Panthers against New Orleans Saints. McCaffrey pushes his way out of bounds past defenders for a pretty good 18-yard gain. You can see this is, some would say, a pretty high effort play. Down below, we have McCaffrey's acceleration and speed mapped out. You can see his speed increases throughout the play and then plateaus as the play ends. Meanwhile, his directional acceleration kind of fluctuates in the positive range. But to the naked eye, these are really just numbers. It's just McCaffrey's speed and directional acceleration. So our goal with this project is to take those numbers and actually translate them into something quantifiable and representative of effort. So a little bit of background here. Effort is intangible and subjective. People can have many different definitions of effort. For example, a running back may exhibit effort when he stiff arms the guy to the ground to get a few extra yards, while someone else may say that a running back exhibits effort when he contorts his body to stay in bounds. Because of this, there's currently no objective measure of effort that actually exists in the NFL. So our idea here is to take previous research that has explored professional soccer players reaching their theoretical max acceleration capacities, which throughout this presentation, we'll refer to this as a player's maximum acceleration frontier. So goals with this project: 1, we want to improve estimation of acceleration speed profiles using statistical modeling like quantile regression. And then 2, we also want to assess how frequently players operate near their physical limits in what we're going to call as our definition of effort. So going into the data, I won't spend too much time on this. It's the same as the previous 2 groups. It's game, player, and player data from weeks 1 through 9 of the 2022 NFL season. This encompasses 136 games. Included in this data set is player tracking data, so X and Y locations, where each frame is in 10 FPS, and this is measured through chips in the shoulder pads and in the football itself. So some pre-processing steps we took. We filtered the running plays where the running back is the ball carrier. So to simplify things, we're only looking at the running back in this case. And also, we're not looking at when the running back receives the ball. We trimmed each play between the frame of the handoff and end of play, and then we also derived directional acceleration. So down below, you can see an example of our data table.
So we initially got our idea from a paper by Moore et al., which involved estimating soccer players' so-called speed acceleration, or AS profiles, as Luke had mentioned. And we adapted Moore's method as follows. So for each player, we plotted speed versus acceleration for each frame. And here you see we're using as a running example 2 players, Christian McCaffrey, who's a starter for the Panthers, and Khalil Herbert, who was a backup for the Bears. And just to avoid getting into too much detail, the big picture is that we fit a linear regression to the top accelerations for each speed recorded. And so that blue regression line you see, we call that the theoretical max acceleration frontier. And just to recapitulate, this line shows a player's maximum accelerations for every given speed. And using this method, we define effort as a percentage of a player's points or frames that lie sufficiently close to and above this regression line. But this approach had several limitations. First, using the procedure from the paper, we excluded points with speeds below 3 miles per hour from the model, which basically disregarded the low speed frames, even though some may argue that effort may still be exerted at lower velocities. Next, the linear regression extrapolates beyond the observed data, which leads to unrealistic estimates of theoretical max speeds, which is like the x-intercept. And for some players, this ended up being like 30 miles per hour, which is obviously kind of unrealistic. Third, players with greater athletic ability are being unfairly penalized because the frontier is being estimated relative to each player's own max accelerations. Players with more high acceleration points will have a curve that is pretty high up compared to other players, and so they have to reach a higher threshold for their frames to be classified as effortful. Next, this model doesn't differentiate between acceleration and deceleration. So we use the magnitude of acceleration as the response, effectively treating all changes in velocity equally, despite our belief that deceleration requires less effort than acceleration, which I'll talk about later. And then lastly, this approach is sensitive to short-term fluctuations. For example, an event that's sort of out of a player's control, like a sudden tackle, could lead to a drastic deceleration, and our model would somewhat mistakenly classify it as a high-effort play. But this issue was fairly simple to fix. We just took a 5-frame rolling mean of speed and directional acceleration. To address some more of these shortcomings from the first model, we decided to try a quadratic quantile regression to estimate the frontier instead. And it's different from the typical linear regression in that instead of modeling the conditional mean, we're modeling the conditional quantile, namely the 0.95 quantile or the 95th percentile. And then again, here we're using Christian and Khalil as the running example. And we simply plot speed versus acceleration as before and fit a quadratic function to the 95th percentile of points with positive acceleration, which you can see is the red line, and another separate one to points with negative acceleration or deceleration, which is the blue line. And we have two separate curves because, again, we want to treat acceleration and deceleration differently when we're computing the actual number for effort, which you'll see in another slide coming up soon. And then on the bottom of the slide, you can see the scores we obtain through this method show Khalil giving more effort than Christian, which is kind of interesting considering he's a backup. And then we also tried an alternative but similar method to estimating the frontier just for comparison. And this was a quantile GAM, where again, we're modeling the conditional 0.95 quantile, but this method is more flexible than the previous fixed form quadratic quantile regression because it's non-parametric. And then again, same thing where we plotted the two separate frontiers for acceleration and deceleration. And you can see on the bottom, Khalil is still doing better. And then as for how we actually computed a measure, like a number for effort, which again is the percentage of frames of players effortful from each of these methods. First, we found the vertical distance d sub I from each point to the frontier corresponding to its acceleration sign. So for points with positive acceleration, this would be the distance to the red line that you saw. And then for negative acceleration would be the distance to the blue line. And then for points surpassing or on or past their respective curve, we set a distance of 0 because we consider that as full effort above and beyond. And each frame is assigned a score according to this formula that you see towards the top of the slide, where a sub I is the point's directional acceleration. And you can see we're taking the reciprocal of distance because we want to reward points with a smaller distance to the respective line. We give them a smaller denominator and thus a larger effort score because they're coming close to their frontier. And then points with negative acceleration, you can see we're treating them separately. We're penalizing them by a factor of 0.5, which comes from prior findings that deceleration is 2 to 4 times less metabolically demanding than acceleration. And so we considered it less effortful. And then finally, we computed the average effort for each player by taking the mean of their frame level scores across all points.
Next, we have the backup RBs league rankings. Both metrics gave similar results, and as we can see, there's a strong correlation between both metrics. Notably, backups lead both lists. We can see McKinnon, Burkhead, Breida, among other backups here. A possible reason for this could be that backups try to make the most of their opportunities with limited snaps, and starters experience fatigue from being out on the field for consecutive plays. Also, starters may just be more naturally gifted, so they don't have to try as hard to achieve good outcomes. Moving on, as shown in these two ranking tables, we can see a mix of starters and backups towards the bottom of the list. Again, each number represents the proportion of time a player exhibits effort. For instance, we can see that Gainwell exhibits effort about 16.8% of the time. In the next slide, you'll see that we found the basic correlations of our effort metrics with some basic metrics that may be considered effortful, like yards gained after contact, EPA, and rushing yards. By definition, effort may not explain favorable play outcomes, since a player's personal effort may only contribute to an extent to a team's success on a play. So situational contexts like variables outside of a player's control or variables that depend on other players play a really big role here. RBs typically give their full effort on every single play running the ball. But in what scenarios might offensive players not exhibit maximal effort? This leads us to wide receivers. Now, do wide receivers give the same effort when they're not targeted versus when they're targeted? Moving on to the wide receivers data, we took a similar approach as we did for RBs. We filtered to frames of receivers running the routes. We also filtered to frames between snap and the arrival of the pass to the intended receiver. And we calculated the speed and directional acceleration with a 5-frame rolling average, just like we did for RBs.
So getting into our actual approach, we just adopted the QGAM approach because we felt this was the more flexible model for us to use. Again, effort is calculated in the same way. Each point on this screen represents a frame of speed and acceleration. The closer that point is to the respective 0.95 positive quantile acceleration line or negative acceleration line, the more effort that point shows. Again, we are cutting deceleration points in half as we found that is less metabolically demanding. We can see here we have Tyreek Hill, a wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins, recently just got injured. And then also we have DJ Chark, who was a wide receiver for the Lions at the time. Unfortunately, he's out of the league at this point. But we can see in 2022, overall, Chark led Hill in effort by about roughly 6%. And then also, Chark led Hill when he was targeted and not targeted. So looking at the overall rankings, we can see Chark leads basically in both categories. Chark is second when he's targeted and second when he's not targeted. What's pretty interesting is you see a lot of like deep route runners on here, such as Marquez Callaway and Mike Williams. We found like a little correlation between deep ball runners or average depth of target and an effort score, probably because you have more opportunity to actually reach your maximum acceleration. But moving on to the bottom of the rankings, we can see Tyreek Hill is pretty bad when he's not targeted. Doesn't show a lot of effort. This is not too surprising, as there's been many example plays where Tyreek Hill has sloppy route running or just kind of walks when he knows he's not getting the ball. You can also see this with other star wide receivers in 2022 in the table to the right. We have Devontae Adams, St. Brown, and Deebo Samuel. So you might be wondering, you're looking at these case examples, but is this really representative of the entire league? And the answer to that is no. When you look at play level effort between when a wide receiver is targeted and they're not targeted, the distributions are basically identical, which this is good news for NFL fans because wide receivers should be giving their full effort, whether they know they're getting the ball or they're not getting the ball. So these case examples we see of wide receivers just being lazy because it's a run play or they just know they're not getting the ball are just merely case examples.
To conclude, this metric quantifies how often a player comes to his acceleration frontier. The AS-based effort alone does not explain performance, and there's no extreme difference in play level effort when a wide receiver is being targeted versus when they're not being targeted. Some of the limitations of this is that the metric does not fully account for game context. For example, when a player gets tackled, he'll experience a huge deceleration on average. Our metric would deem this as effortful, but it's not. Although the rolling average attempts to smooth this effect is not perfect. Also, since these AS curves are personalized for each player individually, it's hard to make cross-player comparisons. For example, in every given frame, we're comparing a player's performance to his own capabilities instead of other players' capabilities. And for future work, we need to better distinguish between high effort points and find a better way to validate our effort metrics.
Once again, I'd like to give a big thank you to Kwong and Dr. Yurko and Sam for all their hard work. If you'd like to connect with us, these QR codes lead to our LinkedIn. We'd love to talk about the project more. But thank you guys very much, and we're open to questions.
All right, thank you. Great job. And so for time going on our schedule, we're actually going to go to a break here. You can be able to ask Luke questions in person here. Thanks to Emily and Sheryl for joining us virtually. Fantastic job. We're going to take a break and be back at 2 p.m.